We're here today with the webinar by the Forum for Foreign Relations with the fantastic Herzberg, Erich, and still to come in about 5 minutes, Mark Voyger. The topic, as with pretty much every conversation now, I think, and for the next 3 months, is the US election and what's next with the US foreign policy for Britain, for Ukraine, for Taiwan, for Israel, and so forth. And all our guests today are American, which is a fantastic way to get their input on this. They're also in different parts of the world. Mark, who will join us shortly, is in either Poland or Ukraine. And I believe you are in Israel, I may be wrong.
Yes, Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem. And Erich is in Pennsylvania, very much the heart of the US. So perhaps it makes sense in this case to start with Erich. And is the US going to be an isolationist nation? Is that what Trump wants? And is that what we should wait for in 3 months for the next 4 years?
So I think first and foremost, as you said, here in Pennsylvania, I think the feeling is a little different than last time when he won in 2016. I think, as everyone has pointed out, he won much more decisively this time. And being sitting here only about a mile from the border to Philadelphia, there's sort of been a noteworthy lack of consternation on the part of a lot of people that you would think would be very upset, and very different than 2016. I was on a college campus in 2016, and there was absolute pandemonium. I was on a different college campus on Wednesday afternoon, and it seemed very calm. I was within the city of Philadelphia on Thursday, sort of business as usual. So kind of in my view, noteworthy lack of consternation this time around. And as I said, I think largely because he won so decisively, including the popular vote. And I think that was a very big deal. So I think, especially in Pennsylvania, I think based on conversations I've had with a ton of voters, I think first and foremost, a lot of people were very dissatisfied with the Biden administration on a host of issues. And the two things that they were most dissatisfied were on domestic issues, in my view, and they were related to prices and they were related to the border. But circling back to your question, I certainly think there is and has been an undercurrent related to how the United States relates to the world, something perhaps best summarized by, we have our own problems with the border and the prices, and we need to address them before we address various other things around the world. So I think when the president-elect announced a night or two ago that Mike Pompeo and Nikki Haley will not be joining his administration, I do think that is indicative, not so much of a shift. I think this is always probably how the president-elect has wanted to relate to the world, but more of a focus this time on probably trying to realize a new relationship to the world that probably he's always favored, but in the past perhaps didn't implement as much in his first term. So the United States, as you know, is a huge country with a huge presence around the world. So I don't know if it's going to be so much barreling into outright isolationism, but I think insofar as there's a spectrum, I think one can expect something of a shift in that direction.
Erich, you're a political analyst, a political expert. You started on the Merion West website that gives fantastic analysis on US policy, foreign policy, all sorts of policy, really.
Thank you for saying that. That's very nice.
I'm guessing you may have been even on the road or on the doorstep with the campaign, and you, like everyone, would have heard many of the Republican voices speaking out against Trump during the election campaign. We know of course, Anthony Scaramucci, who's been in Britain on pretty much everything, saying that Trump is not the man for the job. There have been many others. And how difficult would this situation be for Trump when he takes office, considering that he does have the Hill, it seems, both chambers by now, but if the dissenting voices stay in there, are they going to toe the line, or are they going to speak out against him and create problems?
So, yeah, throughout the campaign, I spent time with a number of the candidates, some of whom I wrote about their their campaigns and some of their priorities. But a lot of the people that I was spending time with, Vivek Ramaswamy, for instance, were very strong supporters of Trump. And I think that most of the opponents of Trump have been largely or not really part of the party as much anymore. I think Trump has a pretty, I don't want to say ironclad, but a very strong, it is his party now. And I think that's fairly clear. He was able to resist sort of going after Larry Hogan when he was running in the Senate race. That would have been an example, perhaps, of a pretty Trump skeptical Republican. But he, of course, lost his race. Mitt Romney is on his way out of the Senate. Anthony Scaramucci, I don't know a single Republican in the United States of America, I think, who would kind of credit him as someone that we should listen to. Mitch McConnell is stepping down as Senate Majority Leader. I actually think the race for Senate Majority Leader may have a little bearing on this question. I would say if Rick Scott does become the Senate Majority Leader, who is kind of the favorite now of the Trump inner circle, Elon Musk, insofar as he's now very close to Trump, and other people, that would probably bode well for more of the Trump agenda being enacted. But I also want to say, not so much on the Republican question, because there are a couple of Republicans who have won re-election in the House who are sort of Trump critics. Don Bacon in Nebraska. I think Dan Newhouse is probably going to win in Washington. But I mention their names because when the margins are small, votes matter. And the Republicans, I think, won the presidential race pretty decisively. They had a very good night in the Senate. I'm still shocked that Dave McCormick won in Pennsylvania. That I think was a huge upset. Very few people I knew, even people involved with this campaign, were not super obvious. You could tell I don't think they were super optimistic. I thought he had maybe a 25% chance of winning or something like that. But the margins in the House are not enormous. We picked up 2 seats in Pennsylvania. The Democrats picked up some seats in New York. So I don't know so much the Republican criticisms, but if you're able to peel off a couple people in the House, that can make a big difference.
That's interesting because, I mean, the names you mentioned, like Ramaswamy, for example, they've been quite outspoken against the US support for Ukraine. But the one thing that they seem to be very cohesive on is Iran. And we've heard recently that there may have been an attempt by the Islamic Republic on President Trump's life. He said that he's the president who ends wars. But considering the support for action against Iran, considering the potential threat to him, and considering that perhaps there is going to be support on the Hill for anything that he does suggest, if he manages to keep that small majority together, are we likely to see some sort of American direct action, be it on the ground, American troops, be it with the American fleets in the Gulf, or maybe supporting something that Israel does?
I think the first one is, in my view, probably almost completely out of the question. I think Trump has been elected on a pretty explicitly no boots on the ground approach. I think that would be against his instincts, but I think politically completely and utterly unsustainable, especially I don't think you even need Bobby Kennedy around him. I think that is against every sort of instinct in his body. So I don't think that's a possibility. And back to people like Mike Pompeo and all. I don't know if Mike Pompeo was going to be in the administration at all, but I think him saying that statement is his way of saying all the people concerned about sort of people involved in interventionist foreign policy, they are not really welcome in my administration. And that's what I think the point of that statement was. That's why all sorts of people I know forwarded it to me within a minute of it happening. And I think it was that was his way of signaling to his voters that, you know what, this is not, you're not going to vote for me on a platform and then have me get in there and do the opposite. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't think, because Trump has been a very outspoken critic of how the Democratic Party, in his view, has handled the Iran issue. And I think he, on the campaign trail in debates, has been very clear that he does not want to see a nuclear Iran or an Iran that is threatening its neighbors. So I don't know exactly how he would approach that. I think it might be too soon to tell, but the possible circumstances you outlined, I think, are within the realm of possibility. So whether it's providing Israel support to do some of the things accomplish some of the goals the United States would like to see as well, I think that's very much possible. Or perhaps even some limited strikes, I think, are also very possible, because I think that the Trump administration definitely wants to see Iran on its back foot and not doing the things it's been doing as of late.
Well, the one country that is potentially on, well, to put it mildly, on the fence about Iran is the UK. And of course, during the election, we heard a lot about the Islamification of Britain with the new Labour government, and the Mayor of London, of course, who's also a Labour Party member. It seems that the special relationship between Starmer and Trump is not that special. And we don't know if the Starmer government is going to carry on for the full period, whether it's going to end this year or next year, or indeed if we're going to have Labour for the full term. But considering things as they are we likely to see a special relationship? Perhaps not the like of Blair and Bush, because that was rather very special, but certainly considering the threats from Iran and so on, the coming together of Britain and America, especially now that Britain is out of the EU, with the Trump-Starmer union.
So I think two things are true at once. I think the president-elect probably isn't super thrilled with the prime minister on a personal level. I didn't follow exactly how it played out, but I know there was some talk of some folks from Labor coming in to try to campaign for Harris. I personally don't know whether or not that actually happened, but I know that was under discussion, and I know the president-elect was not happy about it. But color me naive, but I think that countries' relationships that are on as good of longstanding terms as the United States and the United Kingdom, I think that is a little more durable, perhaps, than the given leader at the time. I know a lot of my British friends were very excited to share with me a video clip of the president-elect on his plane, speaking with reverence of the British royal family and sort of reminiscing about his experiences there with a picture book. And I think that the United States and the United Kingdom longstanding ties. I don't think they call it the special relationship for nothing. So I anticipate perhaps maybe some friction between the two of them, but I think they'll be able to hopefully put some of that aside. You can look at certain other world leaders who seem to not have much in common with the president-elect in terms of their domestic politics, in terms of their approach to the world. I'm thinking of Justin Trudeau in Canada, but Justin Trudeau was very quick to congratulate him, and I think as the two of them have maintained cordial relationships in the past. So I would expect that these guys they're big boys. They play politics at the absolute highest level in the world, and my guess would be that they would be able to keep things focused on the two countries working well together rather than some of their differences.
I think you're very optimistic, and certainly it bodes well for the UK if things do turn out the way you say. But I would say the country that perhaps is closer to Trump than the UK in this regard is Israel. He has said that he's a protector of Israel, although at the same time he said that the Jews would have I'm paraphrasing, a lot to answer for if he's not elected. Now that he is, and who is the legal mastermind of the wonderful watchdog that is NGO Monitor, what is the mood in Jerusalem?
Thanks so much for having me. I would say the mood in Jerusalem is mostly happy about Trump's election, although not without some mixed feelings and concerns. So recent polls I saw of the Israeli public, probably 2/3 of the electorate in Israel was happy about Trump's election. but I don't think it's as clear cut as that. I think when you have to sort of look at the concerns that were happening in the wake of October 7th and how that's played out in what has happened. So, on the one hand, when the Biden administration came in, they weakened a lot of the sanctions and approach to Iran that the Trump administration had had previously. So there were concerns around that. The administration also had rejoined UN bodies that the Trump administration had left. But after October 7th, President Biden came to Israel. He gave an incredible speech, a very supportive speech. And in the immediate aftermath and in the initial days of the war, he was offering lots of military assistance to Israel and was serving really as a block to his left flank and even to other countries in what Israel, how Israel was approaching going after Hamas. That changed as the winter went on. I think also because of the election, because there were concerns that Michigan, which is a swing state and does have a large Arab and Muslim population, was getting frustrated with the support for Israel. So that was causing concerns on the Biden administration, and then they began to give some mixed messaging towards Israel. So you saw in March there was this whole thing, really hysteria, is one way to put it, regarding Rafah, a Rafah operation that did generate, internationally these concerns. You had this ICJ case about genocide. And then you had, of course, the Iran attack on Israel in April, where Biden said, take the win. So those were very concerning developments. Now, as the summer went on and Israel began to have these spectacular military achievements, the assassination of Hania in Tehran, the pager and the pager attack, which was incredible, the killing of Nasrallah, and now Sinwar, it kind of shifted back. But other things that were going on were delays in weapons, supplying weapons because of Biden's left flank. And there was a perception that when he dropped out of the race and Kamala Harris stepped in, that she was not an expert on foreign policy. She seemed to sort of also give those mixed messages. The campaign was playing pro-Israel ads in some states, but more sort of weaker anti-Israel ads in other states, in Michigan in particular. And it was thought that she would probably be weaker on issues involving Iran. So I think those were concerns that Israelis had. And then contrasting that with Trump's first administration, where you had, of course, moving the US Embassy to Jerusalem, recognition of sovereignty over the Golan Heights, moves at the UN, and of course the Abraham Accords were all, sort of, it had engendered very positive feelings for Israelis. Now, but on the other hand, and Trump had had some disagreements with Bibi that he wrote about, and so there was that in the back of, sort of in the background there. What's going to happen with that? Is he still angry at Bibi? Bibi, of course, was one of the first world leaders to congratulate Trump when he won. So I think Bibi is trying to paper that over. And I don't think there was any sort of secret that Bibi was probably hoping for Trump to win. So I think you have that. On the other hand, you also have, as Erich was talking about, there is this isolationist wing in the Republican Party. And so I do think it's much more of an issue for Ukraine, but depending on who comes in to the administration, that could determine the direction. I think for Israel, it's probably less of an issue, but there are still elements on that isolationist wing that are not necessarily pro-Israel and are not in favor of a big military action against Iran. So that's something we'll have to look at.
Well, jumping quickly on the back of that, because much as I asked Erich, the man to end wars is Donald Trump. Now, Israel is engaged in two wars, of course, with in the north and in the west. And potentially there is room, although not a land war because of the distance, but some sort of conflict, escalating conflict with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Are you waiting for help? Are you waiting for the US to, by you, I mean people in Israel, waiting for the US to step in and offer some assistance?
Well, I think right now the main issue is, although Trump has said, he wants to end wars, and I think that is going to be the policy, I think we have to look at a couple of things. The fact that he's saying that, he has also made statements saying he wants to give Israel the space to finish the job, as he would put it. So what that means, I don't know. When it comes to further Israeli attacks on Iran, certainly you have the oil facilities. The nuclear facilities, though, I don't believe, as far as I'm aware from reports, that Israel has the capability to take out Iranian nuclear facilities. I don't know. I don't have, the access to that type of intelligence. So it could be that Israel needs the United States to do something like that. I don't know if either the current administration and the remaining months of the administration or Trump, should they come in, want to help out with that, or if that's on the table. So that's kind of an open question. I do think, however, it's actually, you have wars in Gaza and Lebanon, but we can't forget we're also having war in Yemen, attacks from the Houthis, attacks from militias in Iraq and Syria. And those three fronts are actually quite important to US interests, also UK interests, because of course we have attacks on global shipping from the Houthis, and we have a lot of US troops in Iraq, and they are involved in Syria as well. So, and of course, those do link up to what's happening in Ukraine. So, it is a broader issue for the United States than merely just allowing Israel to do something or helping Israel. Right now, there are a lot of American military assets here. We have air defense systems that have been put in place, the THAAD system, and then there have been B-52 bombers that have come over. So there are a lot of American military assets here. Also, I think some of the names that have been floated for state and names that are involved in the transition have so we have Robert O'Brien, who's been involved, Brian Hooks, who's involved in the transition team. He was very much on the maximum pressure campaign against Iran in the first administration, and he's involved in the transition team in terms of staffing up at state. So, and then Jared Kushner is involved. So I think if we look at those names, there's a lot of Iran hawks whose names are still being floated around. And of course, Iran is supposedly involved in assassination attempts against Trump, and that I'm sure is lingering in the back of his mind in terms of policy. So I'm not sure there's going to be such a walking back of a strong stance towards Iran. Again, I think it's more of an issue really for Ukraine, I would say at this point.
You mentioned about giving Israel the space. Now, with the Houthis, of course, you kind of have to involve the Saudis with Iran and their nuclear facilities. I've read reports that they really started enriching uranium up to 60% only after Biden took office. But the one thing that has been said again and again and again and again is that Israel does not have an exit strategy for Gaza. Does it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's that's really a big problem. It has to be stated. In Gaza, there has been incredible destruction. The humanitarian aid system obviously failed before because Hamas was allowed to take over the territory and basically turn it into this terror state, this terror territory with tunnel infrastructure. Now, a lot of that has been destroyed. Most of Hamas's fighters have been destroyed. The command structure has been destroyed. So they're obviously tremendously weakened, but it's unknown, amongst the population how much support for Hamas remains. So the real question is who is going to come in. I don't think it's sustainable to have the Israeli military serve as, to go back in. They left the territory in 2005 to go back in now and serve as a governing body there. I don't think that's sustainable solution. So I think for the Israelis, they do want to probably look to the Gulf states to help out with that as a moderating force. I think Trump would probably be amenable to that, considering they have very good relations with the Gulf states. But that is going to be a huge challenge going forward for sure, and a harder challenge, I would say, than obviously Lebanon.
Well, talking of the terror networks and the tunnels and the organizations in Gaza, that's very much the bread and butter of your daily grind. And the two that come to mind are UNRWA and UNIFIL, of course, in Gaza and Lebanon, respectively. Israel and NGO Monitor have done a lot to talk about the involvement of UNRWA members in the attack on October 7th, on the multitude of tunnels that exist in Gaza and the tunnels that exist in Lebanon, and the seeming ineffectiveness of the two organizations. Now, excuse me, are you looking for the US to step in and help Israel to perhaps dismantle or change these bodies? And who would you want to see as the US ambassador to the UN?
So I think there's a few things. I think in the first administration, Trump did cut off funding to UNRWA and a couple other UN bodies. They dropped out of the Human Rights Council. So and Nikki Haley was a very strong ambassador combating anti-Israel bias at the UN. So I expect, and also given the names floated at the State Department, but also now it's been reported that I believe Congresswoman Elise Stefanik is going to be appointed the UN ambassador. She's a very strong supporter of Israel. She has been leading the fight against anti-Semitism on US campuses and Congress. The infamous hearing with the university presidents in December, where they could not condemn calls for genocide. She was leading those hearings, and now she's going into the UN. So I think that sends a very strong signal about the administration probably will continue the path that it took during the first administration. I could definitely see them not restoring UNRWA funding, and that could potentially have impact on a lot of the ally countries, the UK, for instance, not that had restored UNRWA funding, perhaps to then withdraw it again, because clearly UNRWA is a failed body. It needs to be restructured, reformed at best, if not completely disbanded. UNIFIL has proven to be an absolute failure. So, and that's billions and billions of dollars. So I could see that type of funding being cut. I think the other point on the UN issues is under the Biden administration, although they did have a very strong stance combating anti-Israel bias in these institutions, they were still providing a lot of money. And in Congress, particularly before 2022, but even after the midterms, when they retained control over the Senate, they did prevent a lot of votes that would cut funding for the UN from being taken up. And there are a lot of bills pending right now to cut UN funding to the Palestinians, bills about sanctions on the International Criminal Court. And now, given that the Senate is under Republican control, and it's highly likely that they will take over the House, even though it might be a very slim majority, and there is bipartisan support for these types of bills, pretty strong bipartisan support, I think we're going to start seeing some of those bills now come to be enacted into law. So I think from that perspective, those things will probably change.
Do you think cutting the funding by the US, which is a major donor, going to be enough, or are you looking for something else?
I think that will send a very strong message, because the UN relies on US credibility. It's a gift to the UN to have the US there, because otherwise then it's dominated by authoritarian regimes. The US is the biggest funder to the UN. Now, with the Biden administration, when they came in, at the time I said, if you're going to go back in, you need to exercise your leverage with the UN institutions demanding reform. Unfortunately, that didn't really happen. So hopefully the administration can do it in a smart way without antagonizing, but really showing that a lot of these anti-Israel mechanisms that are also against US interests, Western interests in a lot of cases, that the UN will have to change if they want to continue to enjoy American largesse.
Thank you. Now, we have been joined by Mark Voyger. Mark is, of course, a contributor to SEPA. He's an advisor to the Forum for Foreign Relations. He is on the American University in Ukraine and has enjoyed a illustrious career in the US Armed Forces. But as a man very much on the ground in Ukraine, Trump and Zelensky, the presidents, have enjoyed a checkered history. I'm thinking of the Burisma affair with Biden's son, of course. But recently, the German newspaper Bild reported in the 25-minute conversation that Trump and actually Elon Musk had with Vladimir Zelensky. Trump said that he'll be happy with him. What does that mean?
Well, that's, in my opinion, Trump's way of saying, I'm going to achieve peace for you. I'm going to accomplish what no one else has done so far. Unfortunately, this is Trump's understanding of peace. That's not the just peace that pretty much the all who understand and who follow this conflict have been talking about, a peace whereby Ukraine is able to reclaim its occupied territories and restore its sovereignty within the 1991 borders. Obviously, most likely, it's a peace for the sake of peace, meaning the absence of, military, at least an overt or very hot military tensions for a certain period of time, which Trump can present mostly to his supporters as some sort of a major diplomatic victory. So I suspect this is what he means. I would very much take Trump's words and behavior at face value when it comes to his consistent messages regarding Ukraine over the course of the years. Obviously, when he was a president, and then obviously during the campaign. Constantly accusing Zelensky of receiving, ridiculous amounts of money, which is, even the numbers are not true. He claims that $100 billion is what Zelensky is stashing in his pockets and leaving before leaving the U.S. That's simply not the case. Exaggerated figures that aim to create the impression within the American public that we've given excessive amounts of money and funding to Ukraine. So I would be much more reluctant to take one meeting where he says just a few nice things, a few niceties, really, at face value. I would actually look for more consistency. Frankly, I'm not holding my breath, to be honest. I mean, I wish I was wrong. I'll be very happy if I were wrong, actually, and this time Trump actually delivers something meaningful. I just don't see how, frankly. So again, it's most likely some sort of an ill-concocted, ill-conceived plan, which I don't even think that Trump has a clear idea what he needs to do. I mean, we heard his promises that within a day after he's elected, he's going to call both presidents and achieve, kind of impose almost peace, which obviously hasn't happened and won't happen in the foreseeable future. So again, don't look at the words. If we have the expression, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, most likely it's a duck. Trump has consistently viewed Ukraine as a problem, a strategic problem for the U.S. the way he understands it, that is, and also personal problem. I would say personal negative feelings, given obviously the prior associations that Biden's family obviously has had with Ukraine. Obviously, that has been, this has particularly provided him over the years with reasons and pretexts to attack the integrity of Biden and his family. I wouldn't expect any magical outcomes. Again, I wouldn't panic. That's what I tell my Ukrainian friends, audiences. I've been speaking at a number of conferences obviously since the elections. So no panic, no hysteria, but let's put it this way: let's hope for the best and prepare for the worst.
The one thing that has dominated kind of the personal news about Trump is his desire to be right and perhaps a certain egotism that has been reported. Now, considering the Burisma affair and the words that he said about Zelensky before, is the personal relationship between the presidents going to be a problem?
Zelensky and Biden, and Zelensky and Trump, you mean?
Yes.
I mean, look, Zelensky, to my knowledge, I mean, obviously he wasn't involved in the Burisma affair. I think that happened a long time ago. Well, at least before his time, in any meaningful way. Disassociating himself from this, unfortunate, occurrence or unfortunate affair, as you call it. I don't think Burisma is going to be the main focus, of course, of Trump's ire or criticism. I mean, that's something that's in the past that kind of has irked him over the years, or, as I said, has rather provided him with the power to criticize and to hold some sort of a high moral ground. Rather, the problem would be actually much more systemic. It will be really the fact that Zelensky is not in a position to sign peace with the Russian Federation, with Putin, who is actually obviously on the offensive. We hear the news from the front line changing by the hour, not only daily. Obviously, there's been talk of potential offensive operations against Kursk and the beachhead that the Ukrainians have there. Also, south in Zaporizhia, potentially a renewed offensive. So there isn't. I don't see any reason why Putin at this particular moment would hold any advance that they may be planning. And so any conflict between Trump and Zelensky would come along this type of fault line. Obviously Zelensky would be, forced by the circumstances, by the course of the war, by the public opinion to, hold the line and push back against any offers of ceding territory, conceding, defeat, etc. Whereas, as I said, in my opinion, Trump would be desperate and pushing hard on Ukraine to achieve a kind of this ostensible, peace, which would actually only mean the temporary freezing of the conflict and some sort of a ceasefire. Call it Minsk III, if you will. It doesn't matter what the name of the city where it signed. What would happen, in my opinion, is a vicious triangle of negotiation, of unfair negotiations would become a fact, whereby Trump would actually be only able to push, obviously, on Zelensky and on Ukraine, as he has no leverage, in my opinion, over Putin and Russia. It's actually probably the other way around.
Well, all politicians care about the course of public opinion. If Trump cares a little bit more, there's been enough voices who said that the delays with the American approval of weapons to Ukraine earlier this year were the workings of Trump, or the machinations of Trump, if you want. These undoubtedly have led to the problems on the front line that we see in Ukraine now, with Russia almost reaching the Dnipro region, which it didn't before, with the push against the Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region, with the of course, the North Koreans joining the war in the first instances of fights between North Koreans and Ukrainians. Now, if the war does end in what the course of public opinion says is an unfavorable situation for Ukraine, that essentially means a loss. Would Trump, if he was to propose a a peace deal to Putin, something that is more favorable to Ukraine than perhaps you think it might be. Do you think if Putin was to say no, Trump would negotiate or do a U-turn and support Ukraine?
Well, it depends on what we mean by saying no. I am totally convinced that Putin would never willingly give up on the territories that he has conquered, and on top of that, territories that he believes that he may actually expand into and get more. Don't forget that the Russians have included in their constitution. It has been stipulated that the four regions of Ukraine, which two of which are half occupied, not completely occupied, obviously, Zaporizhia and Kherson, they are now considered from the legal, well, quasi-legal point of view in Russia as their own national territory. As absurd as it may sound, but from their point of view, kind of the legal portion is there. They view this as if they are reclaiming and liberating something that's legally theirs. Again, it's Russian lawfare, combined with information warfare. It has nothing to do with reality, the way we understand it in the West, the way the Ukrainians want to see it. But in the Russian mind, in the Kremlin's mind, it's very much operational. So that's what we should care about. What Putin would believe that is due to him, right? So I don't think that he will give up on this operational task, also on the strategic task of subduing Ukraine and effectively erasing it as a nation state, as a sovereign nation, even obviously re-engineering the Ukrainian identity. The only thing he could potentially say yes to, again, is a temporary ceasefire, an armistice of the sort of Minsk, as I said. So yeah, that could be possible if, for example, this current attack, let's say between now and the inauguration day, right? That's about 2.5 months, well, even less than that. But let's say until Trump kind of is settled in position, 2.5 to 3 months. If obviously Russia will try to take as much additional territory as possible. We don't know how this will end. If Putin and his command decides that they're not faring that well, they're not expanding so well. I mean, winter is coming, so obviously it will be difficult on both sides, but more difficult on the offensive, on the side that launches an assault rather than on the defending side. So potentially he could then say, well, let's agree to let's say around mid-February. Actually that will be the 10th anniversary of Minsk II, because it was signed, as you know, in the middle of February 2015. He may agree on something that looks like a peace plan. So again, in the big picture is, I don't think he will give up, and he will say yes to. And I actually, frankly, don't think that Trump is ready to propose or to impose a real just deal. As I said, like what would Putin say to Trump if Trump would say, well, vacate all occupied territories, seal the border, and repatriate all children and all prisoners of war, provide funding for the restoration of and the rebuilding of Ukraine. Obviously, we all know it won't happen willingly. So again, the next 2-3 months will determine pretty much to what extent Putin will be willing to say yes to a temporary ceasefire, and then 6 months down the road, toward the summer, or maybe a year and a half from now, in my opinion, he will have reconstituted a substantial portion of his forces. Probably he would bring in additional North Korean troops, more contractors, more mercenaries, and then I have no doubt he would find a way to accuse Ukraine of violating yet another Minsk style agreement, and then launch another round of attacks. The salami slicing tactics that they've cashed this check so many times over the years. So it has worked for them. I don't see a reason why they should not repeat it. Again, I'm pessimistic in the long run, especially with what Trump has been saying and is ready to do. The only kind of silver lining is if there is a temporary ceasefire, then Europe might put its act together finally to actually provide what Ukraine needs to actually at least kind of seal this gaping wound and help Ukraine hold the line and not lose more territories in the long run.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the 4 regions of Ukraine that have been incorporated into Russia, because it's, of course, 5 regions with Crimea. And we've heard,
Indeed. Yeah.
We've heard this week that from Trump advisors that Ukraine should consider Crimea gone. Is that your opinion? Is that something that you think Ukraine can live with? And another question on a very similar note to what I asked Anne earlier. What can be actually a possible exit strategy out of this war? Because you mentioned children, and we're talking about something like 30,000 children, many of whom have been adopted and forced adopted in Russia, many of whom had their names changed. And I'm dubious as to whether it's actually even possible to locate them now, at least some of them. So in one aspect or another, it is going to be a negative portrayal of the defeat in the public eye if, the Ukrainian flag does not fly over the Kremlin. So what can be a possible outcome that might be realistic, obviously short of the Ukrainian flag and short of all the territories going to Russia?
Well, the Ukrainian flag doesn't have to fly over the Kremlin. I know some in Ukraine dream about this, but actually a better scenario would be just that the peoples of Russia would actually be able to take down this really vicious regime, which we had more hopes about this during the first year of the war. Obviously, by now the vertical of power has become much more rigid. And then, on the other hand, as we all know, Russia is never as strong as it looks, and never as weak as it looks. Just like the Soviet Union collapsed so precipitously, and suddenly, the Russian regime might too. So I'm kind of leery of giving any exact predictions, but nonetheless, it doesn't mean that Ukraine has to, conquer Russia and plant its flag like the Soviets did over the Reichstag. But a decisive victory, accumulating. I mean, the hope was last year, at least, when we were all so optimistic, that a humiliating victory inflicted upon the occupying forces would trigger a 1917 type of rout, whereby the thousands and hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers would actually, be forced to defect and run, and then in a chaotic way, thus making the system collapse, potentially with some ethnic trouble and across the empire. Obviously, we're not seeing this now. So back to the question, what's realistic, short of the end of this regime or the personal demise of Putin, with his imperialist persistence, as I call it. It's an obsessive imperialist persistence that he's been using against Ukraine, as opposed to the democratic resilience of the Ukrainian nation. I don't see how this will end in the long run. So I just don't. And so for Ukraine to swallow, for the Ukrainian society to swallow these losses, obviously the children is a gaping wound, really a very emotional issue, which will continue to be one, and especially as those children grow up and they're being brainwashed and turned into potentially janissaries, 21st century janissars that could be used potentially against Ukraine or the West, for that matter, in the next 10, 20 years. Then, of course, there will be always hardliners in Ukraine, veterans. I mean, look at Armenia and Karabakh, the party of war, as they used to call it. I mean, for how many decades they were dictating the politics. in Armenia. So imagine dissatisfied veterans and forming a party after some sort of a ceasefire, and then obviously taking over the body politic in Ukraine or having an undue influence. So Zelensky is in a very tough spot. I mean, I don't envy him, frankly, and I would not envy anyone in his position. But again, he's not in a position to concede defeat. And so again, the only thing that is realistic, that is kind of solution at this point, given that Trump is most likely, as I said, unlikely to be willing to help Ukraine achieve a just and lasting and fair peace, would be for NATO in a revised Ramstein format, of course, and for the European Union, and for non-Western, non-NATO democratic nations, South Korea, Japan, Australia, and some others, who are also interested in not having Russia rebuild its empire, to actually step in and fill in the gap for the next, hopefully only 4 years. We'll see how long this will last.
So that sounds like there might be an outcome by the end of this year, or sorry, by the end of next year, perhaps. And the one thing that I was wondering is, there's a difference between war and reconstruction. War is perhaps in the US considered a charity that is given to the Ukrainians. Reconstruction is very much business. It's something that can make money for both sides. And of course, we have the circa 300 billion that are kind of frozen, but not really, of Russian money abroad. And we have Trump, who was elected on an economic platform, domestically. So are we likely to see, as has been discussed before with the Biden administration, a US involvement in reconstruction, or is it going to be business as usual? I mean, before 22 or even 20, where sanctions go away, where oil is flowing freely, and where Russia is doing what it did before. And perhaps after Mark, if Erich, we can hear your opinion on this as well.
Yeah. Actually, I've been asking this question, of others and, to myself too. Could we potentially use Trump's greed, obviously his claims of being a successful businessman? The reconstruction, of course, would be a multi-billion, well, hundreds of billions of projects, even by moderate estimates, but also merely the manufacturing of weapons, right? To this day, I'm still shocked that our, the great companies' CEOs haven't really sat down with Trump. Or haven't sat him down and said, Donald, the money that you think goes into Zelensky's pockets actually most of it stays stateside. Actually, a lot of it stays in states which have a significant Republican majority, or important for the Republican Army for the manufacturing of weapons. So my kind of limited hope is that his greed, in a good or a bad sense, could be used to actually show him, hey, there's a lot of money to be made of this, so it's good for business, apart from the moral side of things, that we need to rebuild, help Ukraine rebuild and reconstruct. On the other side of the spectrum, he may say, well, but why is it our problem? Let the Europeans take care of it. It depends on be underwriting the bill. If I guess if it's American companies somehow, well, that may happen. But if Trump thinks that the U.S. is supposed to provide the money, and then Europe, Japan, China, or somebody else is to get the lion's share of the contracts, obviously, I'm sure he will be opposed to that. So,
Erich, what do you think? Is it likely?
Well, I think there's maybe a few steps that one has to get to before then. I don't know exactly the time frame we're talking about. We don't know if this is going to be after the midterms. Democrats are going to be in control of the Senate. I think there's a lot of sort of variables that are not settled. Perhaps if we see a scenario where the Democrats are part of the Senate, leading the Senate, and this is part of a negotiation or package, I think there's a lot of going to be different cooks in the kitchen, and I think it can be, at this point in time, hard to forecast the political realities on the ground in the United States if we're talking potentially a couple of years down the road, especially if it's after the midterm elections.
Well, I guess the other thing that might happen after the midterm elections is the potential altercation between Taiwan and China. It's been suggested that it might happen in 26, it might happen in 27, we don't know. Do you think Trump is going to go all out for Taiwan? Because that's going to require a colossal deployment of US resources with aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, to just simply act as a deterrent. And there's only, as far as I remember, 2 gaps in April and October, if I remember correctly, weather-wise, when that invasion can actually occur.
I mean, I think there's definitely, China is definitely viewed as the biggest strategic threat right now in the Republican Party. But again, I think it depends who he appoints, how isolationist, if they're on the isolationist end. You know, from what I've heard from some of the people that are being floated, they want to try to have some kind of détente with China, rather than get involved in a war with China. So I think that's going to play a big role. You know, depending on who's there. I don't know if there's a stomach in the United States to get into a big military confrontation with China, even though they do view it as a strategic threat. So I think that is an open question.
Well, if I may, to all 3 of you, ask a couple of quick fire questions. Now, the person who's been very critical of Ukraine and very critical of Trump at some point is, of course, J.D. Vance. Do you think he's going to last the full term as the VP, or might he be kicked out for one reason or another?
Well, I think the vice president is in the unique position that I believe he's the only person who Trump is not able to fire, as he was elected by the Electoral College. So there is no ability. I'm not a constitutional law expert, but I do not believe the president is able to fire the vice president like he could the Secretary of State or anyone else in the administration.
Yeah, I don't see Vance, resigning from his position short of, some kind of health issue or something. I think he's viewed as a likely successor to Trump to take over the MAGA movement, as they say. So I would think that's unlikely. And he's young. I think that's another point. I don't even think he's 40 yet, or just around 40.
Yeah, also historically, the trend has been that vice presidents have survived most presidents, with the exception was the Spiro Agnew and Nixon at some point, if I'm not mistaken. So I can only remember one case where a president was running without his vice presidential counterpart. And yes, he's sufficiently young, obviously much younger than Trump, potentially more likable. I mean, maybe kind of sounding, but if not more reasonable, at least not as lunatic as in his statements as Trump does publicly. So I would say he has a potential within the Republican Party, and yes, of course, he will have to. Most likely, he will stay for this mandate, and potentially he may obviously run for after Trump has exhausted his legal options to continue in office.
That's interesting you say that, because especially as there have been reports that the reason for his selection was a strong suggestion by a group of wealthy businessmen from the Silicon Valley for him to take the VP position. In this regard, is Harris finished in top-level US politics?
Well, normally, presidential candidates that are, well, with some exceptions, of course, but normally they don't return. I mean, Nixon did. Obviously, he lost to Kennedy, and then he had a comeback in '68. So it's not unheard of, but I mean, she wasn't such a well-known figure back then. Before she ran for office. So it remains to be seen. Frankly, it's I mean, she has gathered sufficient votes. She actually gathered more money. I mean, she was able to at least outspend Trump. I think by a substantial. Was it over 2 billion to Trump? So what is it? 1.8. That shows some sufficient level of trust within the business community. I mean, I wouldn't rule it out. I wouldn't I wouldn't call her I wouldn't call this an impossible thing for the future. It's just it remains to be seen to what extent she will become active. I mean, she kind of suggested that she'll stay around to fight another day. So maybe we should be looking forward to another try.
I think it's pretty unlikely. I don't see, especially given there are a lot of strong candidates on the Democratic side. Josh Shapiro, the governor from Pennsylvania, is obviously the number one person I think you have to think about. Gretchen Whitmer, Michigan, her name comes up a lot. And obviously people that we can't even imagine right now, that come in onto the scene. Obama was not known as a figure after the 2000 election, and then he sort of came out of the scene pretty rapidly. So, but I think given that she dropped out in 2019 before there was even a primary and without getting any votes, and the fact that she didn't win in this round, I think it's unlikely that she would remain as a power player in the Democratic Party, but stranger things have happened.
Indeed.
So I'm always wary of making election predictions. I remember being on Bill O'Reilly's show the day before the New Hampshire primary in 2020, where I was sort of cajoled into agreeing that Biden's political career was completely finished, and then he went down to South Carolina, won Super Tuesday, and that was that. So I've learned my lesson. I've written articles about it, trying to make predictions. But I will echo a lot of things you just said. She had the worst electoral college showing since Michael Dukakis in 1988. She's the first Democrat to lose the popular vote since John Kerry in 2004. As you said, she dropped out in the 2020 presidential primaries when I think it was still 2019. I think she had not garnered a single vote. I believe she was consistently the least popular vice president in American history. A lot of people in places like Pennsylvania, she drives them up a wall. They just don't like her on a visceral level. And I would be absolutely shocked to see her ever have a career in politics again.
Well, to push you for another prediction, if the US was to drop out of NATO, can the organization exist without America? Or in fact, can America, in its current standing, exist without NATO? That's another question.
All right. So what you're asking us is really, could anyone or anything substitute the raw muscle, of an $800+ billion gorilla, right? The U.S. defense budget. Can something replace it really if push would come to shove? Look, let's put it this way: the primary function of NATO being collective defense would not be a realistic scenario without the U.S. I mean, that's if it comes to a pan-European or a global war, a world war, whereby the democracies of the West would have to defend against Russian onslaught, or maybe some sort of combined global challenge by the axis of autocrats. I don't see how Europe could handle it on its own, with Western Europe or Western and Eastern Europe. But short of this catastrophic global scenario, some of the other functions of NATO, let's say training, working with partners and allies, could be potentially possible. I mean, look at the training that the UK has been providing to Ukrainian forces, Canadians, obviously with the weapon systems given by the French, including advanced ones, obviously the Germans, etc. So yes, on a global strategic, global conflagration type of level, no. But in a situation where the war is simmering, at least it hasn't expanded into some sort of a global conflict. I think if Europe puts it together, it could at least sustain the war effort in Ukraine to some extent, and then continue building up its forces along the eastern front line until at least to the extent that it's able to dissuade Russia from any adventurous attacks down the road.
I think NATO disappearing is an unlikely scenario, but I think where the trouble could be is on NATO expansion. I think that's maybe where there there's going to be potentially debate.
Well, let's call it growth rather than expansion. Expansion.
Okay, yeah. That's good. I mean, NATO plays a critical role. I think it's important not only for the NATO countries, but also for countries like Israel. I mean, NATO is critical. So I certainly would hope that the incoming administration is not thinking along those lines. But so it seems unlikely. I think we'll probably see pressure again in terms of countries upping their defense budgets. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure placed on European countries from that perspective, like we saw in the first administration. That I can imagine definitely increasing or demands of the Europeans to share a bigger burden, in terms of taking action in terms of the joint defense. But I don't think it's on the table to eliminate NATO, at least at this point.
Yeah, to echo some of my comments in the beginning about sort of this spectrum of sorts of a shift toward isolationism. Similarly, back to Vivek Ramaswamy, folks I know who work in the federal bureaucracy are calling, am I about to get fired? And I said, I don't think so. I think it's more of a move in that direction more than a binary 0-1. So to echo Ant's comments, I don't think it is seriously on the table to say we're leaving NATO. I think it's more of trying to put pressure on other countries to do things differently or spend more or be more responsive in the view of the incoming Trump administration in certain ways. So I think that is probably more of kind of an arrow moving in a direction rather than sort of throwing one's papers up in the air and saying we're out of here.
Well, where a minute adjustment does make a huge amount of difference is in the economy. And if the Trump government, under an isolationist or a domestic-focused, if you wish, umbrella, decides to either impose tariffs or some sort of quotas for trade with the UK and the EU, that's going to create a very big problem for well, especially for the UK now that we don't have the EU market, really. So is it likely, and what do you think is going to be a result of that? Perhaps.
I think I'm not an economist by any means. I think Trump has said he wants to impose tariffs. Again, I think that's gonna, but I think there's a very significant part of the Republican Party that would be against such a move. Certainly, that's against conservative economic policy. So I think even if he's saying that, and there are some in the more, again, Tucker Carlson type disturbing wing of the party, have his ear on that. But, depending on who he puts in terms of his economic advisors, I can see them, probably trying to walk that back a bit. But again, I'm no expert on tariffs or economic policies. So.
Is that something you've heard, Erich?
Again, I think it's a question that comes back a little bit to how the sausage is made. So I know this isn't exactly my area of expertise, but I know that there's something called Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 that allows a president to, in what's considered the interest of national security, impose tariffs up to a point. without having to go through Congress. But I know Rick Scott was saying that a lot of Trump's tariffs probably would require 60 votes in the Senate. Then there's a question of, can that be put into budget reconciliation? We're going to see how the Senate parliamentarians going to rule. So I think this is going to be like a lot of policy proposals that, I know we've had a lot of the growth of the so-called imperial presidency, but the president still is not the king, especially in the United States. We have a pretty interesting system of how we get laws done. So, and to Ann's point, there's still free traders in the Senate. And it's not just Mitch McConnell. I'm not John Cornyn. It's not my job to whip votes. And also I don't know exactly how everyone's going to vote and such, but, for all we know, Mike Crapo in Idaho is a free trader or something. So I don't know exactly how people are going to vote, but, I do think that the president-elect will be able to, on a limited basis, do some tariff work on this Section 232 that I mentioned, but there's going to be a lot of variables as to what can be in budget reconciliation, what could get 60 votes. But it's actually not just a Republican Party thing, protectionism. There are plenty of people on the Democratic side of the Senate, Bernie Sanders type people. Historically, they actually had a lot of Republican policy positions. They supported a strong border because of concerns about wages of American workers. They are, in many respects, protectionists. And I think there is a growing, as you said, and sort of, as you mentioned, that a lot of people are kind of concerned about China as the chief adversary. There are a lot of people on the Democratic side of the aisle who don't necessarily disagree with that. The Biden administration kept a number of tariffs as well. So I actually don't think this is just, the GOP's like, we're going to have tariffs. There are probably sort of the spirit of the time is probably more Republicans who go along with it due to political considerations, because we tend to oppose whatever the other side's doing these days in America. But I think there are a number of people on the Democratic side of the aisle who would be open to this as well. So maybe it could get 60 votes.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I mean, I hope I'm not exposing anyone here, but I'm guessing that the speakers today are all on the Republican side of the spectrum in the US. But it's remarkable how the difference in some of the views and optimism and pessimism regarding the positions of, especially in foreign policy, regarding Ukraine, for example. Excuse me. But thank you very much for joining us today. It was fantastic to have you here. I'm sorry we overrun a little bit.
Thank you, Stepan.
Well, thanks for having us. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.